Welcome out, everyone. I'm Corinne Joye Votaw, sports photographer, and today we're talking about something that's genuinely near and dear to my heart, rugby. This video is your crash course for photographing rugby for the first time. Not a full rules breakdown, not a deep strategy class, just the essentials you need to show up, generally understand what you're seeing, where to set up, and walk away with photos that you're proud of. This is the first video in a series. This one is meant to be the I'm new, I'm nervous, what do I even do guide. Then we'll go through deeper in follow-ups, camera settings, anticipating play, specific rugby moments, how to shoot scrums, mauls, and lineouts better, and how to get consistent portfolio level images. We'll also take it out to the field with some real teams and do some practice work in future videos as well. I shoot for major publications like USA Today, and my work has also appeared in Sports Illustrated. Over the past year, I photographed men's and women's pro rugby in the US, pro rugby in the UK, the most recent Women's Rugby World Cup in the UK, and I served as an official photographer for the Pacific Nations Cup, shooting teams like USA, Japan, Canada, Samoa, and more. And despite all that, this entire career started because I showed up at a rugby match with a decent camera, a decent eye, and the desire to get some shots of my partner who was playing. I'm still very much a newbie, so I'm also going to bring in other rugby photographers in future videos so that they can share what they've learned in their journeys. Before we start, I need to talk about why shooting rugby matters. The sport is still growing, especially at the youth, college club, and adult club levels. And photography is one of the fastest ways to build exposure. A great image can turn into recruitment, recognition, community pride, or sponsorship potential. Or maybe just interest because someone saw a photo and said, wait, what is that? That looks amazing. Rugby is also one of the most inclusive sports communities you will ever walk into. Different body types, different backgrounds, massive age gaps, different identities. There is a place for everyone in rugby, and players are genuinely grateful when photographers show up because a lot of teams don't get that consistent coverage. So just you being there, respectfully, safely, consistently, and sharing images with them afterwards matters way more than you would ever imagine. And here's something I love about the rugby culture. It's one of the only sports I've seen where from the most novice of teams all the way up to professionals and players on national teams, both teams will celebrate the match together afterward, regardless of who won. It's true camaraderie. That community spirit is part of why this sport is so special and part of why documenting it matters. Now, as an assumption for this crash course, I'm mostly talking about club level rugby. High school, under 18, college club, adult club. I won't be getting into details on credentials, media vests, restricted professional zones, or pro-level access rules. That will be covered in a follow-up video. And at the club level, you're often going to have a lot more freedom to move around the field. But it varies, so always introduce yourself to the teams or the refs and ask where you're allowed to be. Here's a little context on how this crash course is structured, so you always know where we are. We're going to break this into 3 simple sections. Part 1 is the pitch and the play, just enough to understand what you're seeing and where the big moments come from. Part 2 is going to be positioning and where to focus, where to stand, how to stay safe, and how to consistently get faces, the ball, and the try line action. And Part 3 is gear considerations. A quick overview of what helps, what to prioritize later, and how to work with what you already have. This is your typical rugby pitch. Now, at the club level, it's often either played on a soccer field or a football field, like a high school football field. So you may see an existing of field markings and rugby lines painted over the top. Now, some things you'll need to know about the rugby pitch. This line right here, and the same on the opposite side, is the try line. Behind this area is known as the in-goal area. It's not dissimilar from an American football end zone, But unlike football, just crossing the line itself doesn't score you a touchdown. In rugby, it's called a try, and you actually have to ground the ball. I'll give you more details on why that matters in a minute. Other things that are important here are the end posts. Now, typically in rugby, they're H posts. But again, if they're playing on a football field, like a high school American football field, there's probably already uprights there, and it's not uncommon to just use those uprights instead of putting up additional uprights. There's just a few things you need to know for your first game. You'll want to know where the dead ball line is, or basically the back of the try zone or in-goal area. That's going to be important because if you're setting up at one end, you want to know how far back you need to be to not interfere with play. Also, along the edges are the touch lines. So this is one of the things Americans are starting to wrap their heads around. That first, this is called a pitch as opposed to a field. But the touch lines signify the touch area. So when a ball goes out of bounds, it technically goes into the touch area, so otherwise known as into touch. There's one other line that matters that will go deeper in the future, and that's the 22-meter line. Not super critical to know about it for your first match. It's just useful as a reference point. And you'll often notice teams make different decisions, either inside or outside of the 22. It's also a handy mental map that predicts when play might shift, when teams might kick, and when pressure builds. So the 22-meter line, think of it like a red zone in football. It's where the action really kind of gets in. And then, of course, there's the halfway line. This is where the game starts, kickoffs following tries, and so on. And that's it as far as the basics. We're going to go into more advanced stuff of the field in future videos. You might not understand rugby yet, and that's okay. You can still shoot it well if you understand the handful of things that create the best photos. Where the scoring happens, where the faces are, and what moments repeat every match. Now, rugby often doesn't look like a straight downfield, march to the try zone because you can't pass the ball forward. So what you see instead in play often moves in kind of like a zigzag pattern, with passes going sideways or backwards as people move down the field. Now, kicking can go forward, and line breaks where if someone has the ball and they see an opening and they go for it, sure, that happens. But the rule is backward pass, forward progress. Rhythm is a big part of what you're watching. Now, what you'll often see is players line up so the next receiver is slightly behind. So if I had a player here, a player back here, player back here, player back here, and this person might also be a little bit behind. And as play progresses downfield, let's suppose this person has the ball and they're moving downfield. Other people are moving downfield with them, though slightly behind them, because if they run into a challenger, they'll need to pass the ball or kick or do some other things. But for now, we're saying pass the ball. So this person has a couple options. They could pass it to this person. Technically, they could pass it to either side, or they could pass it and skip a person and pass it over here if they were so inclined. But either way, it has to be a backwards pass. Now, what happens is as players are moving down the field, so we'll line this up. Here. Everyone's kind of running down the field at the same time. This person's in the lead. They run into a challenger. They're going to pass this ball to this person here. This person's going to continue down, and now this person drops back and stays behind. So they're now behind. These people have moved up. So you can kind of see how passing the ball still gets you downfield. Now, here's that curious detail I mentioned before that's unique to rugby. Getting the ball over the try line does not automatically equal a score, does not equal points. The player has to ground the ball, that is, touch the ball to the ground in the in-goal area. And where they ground it can matter a lot. Also, down in this area, you'll get some very interesting shots because defenders can still tackle this person, hold them up, hold the ball up to stop the score. So even though they're already in the in-goal area, if the defenders can keep the ball from touching the ground, they can prevent the try. And if it gets held up, the ball is dead and there's a restart. So that moment matters quite a bit. So someone comes in here, until they ground a ball, you keep shooting them. After a try, you'll often get a conversion kick. The kick is taken on a line straight back from where the ball was grounded. Here's what that looks like. So if I were a rugby player and I were to ground the ball, let's say here, the conversion kick can happen anywhere along this line. As you can see, that's gonna matter in terms of distance and angle. So you'll often see people trying to ground the ball here behind the end post, or depending on which way the kicker likes kicking, slightly to the side. And these are ideal spots to score the conversion points. If a person kicks the ball or downs the ball further down here, for example, as I draw that line out and I think about where to kick that ball from, if I were to kick it from here, that's a nearly impossible angle to get that over those lines. So, okay, I'd want to go far enough back so that the angle becomes optimal. The problem is, once you start getting some distance back here, where maybe something like this is a much better angle to make that kick, the distance is going to make that really hard to clear. So this is why you'll see people wanting to score here, because the person can come back here, here, here. You get a nice easy kick from either side. Now, not saying it's easy, but compared to some of the outside edges, it's considerably more easy. All right, part 2, positioning and where to focus. The most important part of this crash course is where to stand. If you do nothing else right, do this right. Now first, a quick safety reality. Rugby is physical, it's fast, and it's unpredictable-ish. The play can swing wide with almost no warning, and players can sprint full speed towards the sideline. So stay aware, stay mobile, and never become part of the match. Don't kneel where you can't move. If play is coming at you, step back early. When I arrive, I check 2 things: sun and background. I want the sun mostly at my back so faces are lit, and I want the cleanest or most meaningful background I can get. Sometimes it's a crowd, sometimes it's just a clean tree line. At the club level, one of the best things you can do is introduce yourself, not just to the team, but to the refs. Let them know you're there to photograph. Ask them where you can be. They'll usually appreciate it, and it helps you stay safe and out of the way. Now, if it's the kind of field setup where people's families are just sitting in chairs right next to the touchline on both sides, those situations are usually a sign it's a more casual environment. So yes, you're definitely welcome to walk the sidelines and take the pictures you need. Just do it respectfully. Stay out of play and keep your head on a swivel. My default position for shooting rugby is typically on the end of a field and usually in a corner. Right here behind the dead ball line, or sometimes over here outside the sideline, but generally behind the dead ball line. Now, what's great about being here along the edges is the field of view you get. I was once tempted, and by tempted, I mean I was asked to sit directly behind here at a pro level game. And I thought, okay, that's great. Yeah, I'll be able to get some great shots. Unfortunately, when I was locked in that position, I realized my field of view was remarkably obstructed by these posts. Not great. You don't want to get locked into that. Yeah, I got some interesting shots here, and I got some interesting shots here along the edge, sure. But as opposed to here, where my field of view is literally the entire field, you definitely want to be closer to a corner. Now, that might make you a little bit further away from the action that happens over here, but that's where the proper lens and positioning and moving comes into play. Now, like I said, if you're going to be at a club level, you will mostly have access to the sidelines. I generally don't at a professional level. I mean, that's where you have like the teams and coaches, or you have like television crews or things like that over here. Sometimes I'll shoot on the sidelines, sometimes I won't. Sidelines aren't always the best place to get the shots from, though. What you end up doing when you're shooting on the side, remember how I was talking about play goes sideways, side to side, you get a lot of profiles of players. You don't always get the faces, you don't always get the balls. So you're not always going to get the 2 faces and a ball That's kind of the standard look for sports photography. Now, there is one exception where I will almost always try to be on a sideline, and that's during a line out. Now, for a line out, you'll typically have 2 lines of players from 2 teams. Suppose there's a line out here. No, we'll say here. Players from each team will line up on either side of that point, and they'll face this direction. Now, this player, the player who's throwing the ball in, technically has to throw the ball straight in, straight down. Do they angle a little bit sometimes? Yeah, they do. Does it get called? Yes, it gets called. Sometimes you'll hear a play called not straight, which for the amount of lesbians in this game, it's fantastic. But either way, these teams will face here. And then different people will pop up, literally get lifted up in an attempt to confuse each other or to catch the ball up higher or steal it from the other team. It's really interesting to shoot. Now, as I mentioned, I generally don't shoot on the sidelines. But supposing I was positioned here in the corner, and if the lineout is going to be somewhere between here and, well, we'll say here and here, yes, I am absolutely going to move my bum from this spot. I'm going to come over here. I'm going to stand behind the person throwing it in, and I'm going to get a shot of the faces of the people popping up to try to catch that ball. You get the back of the thrower, you get the arms, you get the faces. It's a beautiful shot. I think I'm overlaying some shots right now that you can see that are examples of that. Aside from that, I'm almost always at the end. Now, what's cool is at the most adult levels and in many youth club environments, you're gonna see the lineouts that include the lifting. It's one of the coolest, most fun things to shoot in rugby. Now, one of the biggest reasons I stay at an end is because the sport ultimately comes to you. Rugby is a halftime sport. So the team that was going, this way the first half is going that way the second half, and vice versa. So if I can set up down here, I'm going to get the faces of Team A coming in that way, and then I'm going to get the faces of Team B coming down that way. It's a great spot to be just in one end, and you'll consistently have the sun behind you lighting up the faces. So it's great setting up on one end. Now, it can be tempting to chase the play up and down the sideline, but like I said, except for lineouts, that's rarely your best move if you want faces, ball, and try-line action. In regard to what to shoot, if your longest lens is, say, like a 70 millimeter, then yeah, you'll most likely want to walk the sidelines to get closer shots. But when you do that, if I, for example, had a shorter lens and I was walking the sidelines, if I had, say, like a 70 millimeter lens, anything beyond this line, I'm not even going to bother trying with. Anything beyond like a 50 millimeter lens here, the images just don't turn out the way you hope they were, and you end up seeing like a crowd of people in the distance, and you have no idea what's going on. You want to get in tight. These are still great shots. Play is the field is actually, there's not a consistent width to the field. There's supposed to be somewhere between 60 and 70 meters, but again, high school football fields, soccer fields, you get lots of different widths. So you can possibly, with the 70 millimeter, like get out to like a halfway across the field horizontally. Just make sure you really punch in tight on people. And we'll talk about cropping and things like that in future videos. As a rule, don't crop, but you do what you have to do sometimes. The basic rule for shooting rugby is the basic rule for all sports: 2 faces and a ball. A classic sports photography guideline that's existed for as long as there's been sports photos. You need context, and rugby rewards that. Now, if you're constantly shooting people's backs running away from you, your images will feel less connected and less emotional. Just not as good. Sometimes, though, that's all you can get. Here's an example shot I took with the U.S. women's match against Fiji. Would it have been better if the lifted player in the lineout faced me? Yes. But even though we can't see Erica's face here, we can see the action. We can see the emotion of the other players, and perhaps most importantly, we can see a sold-out arena. That picture communicates story in several different ways to several different types of people. As play continues, stay on the ball carrier, but don't get tunnel vision. Watch for the tackler's expression. Watch for hands reaching. Watch for supporting runners arriving, defenders bracing, the instant of impact, and the release of the ball. Then you've got some high-value repeats. Tries, conversions, and celebrations. Inside the attacking zone, near the try line, lock in, track the runner, and shoot the grounding. After the try, pivot immediately to the player who scored because they're most likely to be celebrated by their teammates. This is where you're going to get hug shots, reaction shots, tears, some of the best stuff. Hunt that emotion. Then what you'll want to do is you'll want to pivot to the kicker. The kicker has a limited amount of time to make the conversion, so they'll move quickly. Once you get those celebration shots, pivot quickly to them, get pictures of them setting up the ball, the kick, and the reaction as they miss or make the conversion, and then the teammates that congratulate them. Now, two rugby-specific moments that can look incredible, even if you don't know every rule, are the lineouts we talked about before and the scrum. Now, the lineout happens when the ball goes out of bounds or into touch. Those are the same thing. Players line up like we talked about earlier. The ball gets thrown in. You'll often see a lift. Visually, it's one of the coolest moments in rugby. You've got height, hands, timing, faces. If it's close to you and can move safely, you get that angle toward the contest and catch the peak moment. Now, scrums are where packs bind together and push, and the ball gets fed in. Scrums can be tricky to shoot because the wrong angle just gives you a lot of people's backsides. Instead, look for faces and strain, the edges of the scrum, the player feeding the ball, the moment right before engagement and expressions are intense. Typically, you'll hear calls for a scrum. You'll hear crouch, bind, set. Crouch is when everyone gets down into position. Bind is when they lock in, and set when the scrum engages and becomes properly formed. Then once it's stable, the scrum half will feed in the ball underneath and the pushing begins. If you can get a low angle on a scrum, like if you're on a sideline for whatever reason and the scrum is near you, you can get some really cool under the scrum shots. Just be really careful when you do that. Now, as far as gear is concerned, start with what you have. Do not go buy something just because you're excited about rugby. But here's what helps, and here's what to prioritize later. A DSLR or mirrorless camera with good autofocus and burst speed is ideal. Now, I mentioned the DSLR because they are typically really cheap used and can take absolutely amazing pictures. Ideally, you want something with a minimum 7 to 10 frames per second for burst speed. But if your camera only shoots 1 or 3 frames per second, that's perfect too. If you shoot mirrorless, readout speed matters because slower readout can cause rolling shutter distortion. Makes fast action look a little warped. Now, don't panic about this for your first match. It's going to be fine. But if you're comparing mirrorless bodies later, prioritize faster readout speeds for sports. Now, lenses matter a lot because the field is big. The beginner-friendly workhorse is something like a 70 to 200. If you're near an end, it gives you a ton of usable coverage in the attacking zone and into the in-goal area. The main limitation is when the action gets close. 70 millimeters can feel a bit tight. So consider that in how you position. If you can add reach, it helps a lot. A 100 to 400, 150 to 600, or 200 to 600 lets you stay tight in on the action from farther away, reaching all the way out to like the midfield. It helps you blur the backgrounds, which is a huge at club field where backgrounds can be messy. Long lens plus clean background is how you make rugby look like a feature story. Don't be scared of getting too long. I had an opportunity to shoot a match and someone had this, the Sony 400 to 800 millimeter zoom. I had never tried it. I thought it would have been way too long, but its shots turned out great. So you never know. Longer the better sometimes. For me, I always try to shoot with the 70 to 200, and I'm lucky enough to have a 400 millimeter prime. Those are my go-to lenses for long field sports, whether I'm shooting soccer, football, rugby, any of it. But you don't need those lenses, especially if you're shooting day games, which is what most club rugby is. In that scenario, a long zoom lens, even if it has like a higher f-stop, you're still going to be able to get some pretty good shots. Pretty great shots, if I'm being honest. Let me wrap up this crash course into a simple plan. Show up early, introduce yourself, and ask where you're allowed to be. Check the sun and the background. Pick one end and a corner and let the play come to you. Prioritize faces and the ball. Shoot through the grounding on tries. Pivot to conversion kicks. And then do not underestimate the emotion of celebration. Celebrations are easily some of my best shots. And remember, you're not just taking pictures. You're building visibility for a sport that deserves it, helping teams tell their story and showing people how inclusive and powerful rugby is. Don't be scared to get to know the other photographers. Every opportunity I've gotten has come from that. I started less than a year ago, and I started shooting rugby, and now I've traveled the world shooting rugby on some, quite literally, of the world's biggest stages. And that is solely because I got to know the other photographers who were there. Rugby photographers are there because they want to promote the sport, which means they want to help you get better too. Introduce yourself. Don't be scared of them. If someone's doing something and you don't know why, ask them. They'll tell you. Be kind, be humble, be grateful, because that's what rugby is all about. Thank you so much for watching this crash course. If it helped you feel more confident walking onto a rugby pitch with your camera, do me a favor and hit subscribe, because I've got more rugby photography videos coming in this series, including settings, anticipation, and breakdowns of specific moments like scrums, mauls, lineouts, and try-line action. And I'd love to hear from you. Drop a comment with any specific questions you have. Tell me what you're struggling with, positioning, lenses, timing, whatever, and I'll either answer those questions in the comments or I'll build that into a future video. And if you're a club, a school, a tournament director, or a team that wants consistent coverage, I am available for hire for rugby photography locally, and obviously I travel as well. So you can reach out to me through the links in this description. Thanks again for being here, and I'll see you on the pitch.